everybody. Welcome to the Institute for Government. Good to see so many familiar faces here tonight. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Nicola Hughes. I'm a senior researcher here. I think you were actually promised Peter Thomas on the bill. I'm his sort of less beardy, slightly less witty counterpart. So you've got me. A lot of you have been sort of involved with this programme as it's been going along, but I'll just briefly explain what it's all about and why we're here tonight. So the Connecting Policy and Practice programme is a partnership between Big Lottery Fund and the Institute for Government. We started this a couple of years ago, and it was sparked really by some pretty interesting new investments that the Big Lottery Fund were doing. So they were investing quite serious cash over quite a long period of time in some of those sort of policy areas that policymakers have really struggled to get a handle on. Long-term issues like okay, technical issues resolved?
I think so.
Hurrah. Yes, so this is sparked by the Big Lottery Fund's new investments into some of those really tricky policy areas, so young people who have been out of work or training for a long time, people with multiple complex needs, and they were doing these investments in quite a sort of unusual, interesting way compared to how we typically see public services. So investing money for the long term, really putting people and service users at the front and centre of those programmes, and also really encouraging sort of collaboration, local partnership. And we at the Institute had done a lot of work on public services and on open policy making, trying to encourage a more open approach in both of those areas. And we thought that these investments were a really interesting idea and something that we wanted to learn from. I suppose more broadly as well, you know, we had encouraged policymakers in Whitehall and indeed ourselves as an organisation to look out beyond there into the real world and see how policy making was sort of happening on the ground and what delivery looked like in practice. So that was the spark for the programme. We've been doing it for 2 years now. The way it works, as many of you will know, is that we recruit groups of 30 people, half from the policymaking profession in government in Whitehall, and half from the voluntary sector, usually people who are delivering on these Big Lottery Fund investments. And over the year, we pair them up, so a policymaker and a frontline practitioner work together over the year to deliver a project which will help to answer some of the complicated social policy sort of problems that we're looking at, but also to understand each other's worlds, so to go out on visits, exchanges, to get to know each other and to sort of work jointly on problem solving. We also have them in for roundtables and workshops, which many of you will have participated on. So what we want to do tonight is celebrate the work that we've done over the last year with this latest cohort. A lot of the focus is going to be on them and their work and what they've done. And we also sort of want to talk about some of our conclusions from having done this programme for the last couple of years and what we've found about how to sort of address these gaps between policy and practice. So, format from the event, we're going to try not to do too much sort of chalk and talk, slightly different setup from the usual panel event, but we are going to have some very brief presentations, firstly from my colleague Joe here, who's been programme managing this over the last year. Secondly, from two people who have participated in the programme, Dominic Ruffy from the Amy Winehouse Foundation and Matthew Nicholas from Ministry of Justice. And finally from Dawn Ostwick, who is Chief Executive of the Big Lottery Fund. And then on to the main event, which is going to be a sort of slightly more interactive breakout session where you'll get to hear directly from the pairs and talk to them about what projects they've been doing, what they found, and what sort of solutions they're proposing. After that, of course, is the famous IFG networking, canapes and drinks, so we hope you can stick around for some chats afterwards. Just a brief bit of housekeeping. This event is on the record, so don't say anything too outrageous. If you are a tweeter, please tweet. Hashtag is up there, open policy, along with the login details for the Wi-Fi if you're not already connected. So I hope you enjoy the event, and I will now pass over to Joe to talk about what we've learned from the programme over the last year.
I'm going to stand, that's right. I've been asked to introduce some of the work that we've been doing over the last year and the conclusions that we have reached and published in a report that we released today on our website, and which there are copies outside that hopefully some of you have picked up already. So I think the place to start is where we started this year with the current cohort, which is what we found in our first year, which concluded in November 2013. and through which we identified 5 disconnects between policy making in Whitehall and how it appeared on the ground. The first of those disconnects was that people's lives, particularly those who are vulnerable and excluded, are messy and complicated. The services that work best with them are the ones that treat their needs together, treat them as the whole person, and which are collaborative across different agencies. But too often we thought policy operates in silos at both national and local levels, and it doesn't allow enough time for collaborations to form. The second disconnect that we found last year is that lots of these problems with vulnerable groups are long-term, they require long-term thinking, but the efforts of people working on the ground are often frustrated by the way that policy chops and changes and the lack of stability in the funding environments in which those people and organisations operate. The third disconnect that we found in the first year was around the idea that preventative services we can all identify with the fact that they seem intuitive and probably cost effective, but finding the space to create those services and to evaluate them, especially within a constrained funding environment, is quite hard. The fourth disconnect was around intentions and the idea that policy often starts with policymakers with very good intentions, including making the best use of voluntary sector and their delivery skills on the ground. But often these intentions get lost as policy trickles down to the delivery landscape. And then the final disconnect that we identified in the first year was around service users and how customer insights, in-depth understanding of service users, including a direct role for them in designing and delivering services, can and has been used to great effect, but too often policy discussions are about service users as problems rather than treating them as assets to be used to improve services on the ground. So through the second year of the programme, we wanted to narrow down a bit and give the second cohort an opportunity to kind of focus in on 2 of these disconnects to really try and reach some practical solutions and some insights to help people working on these issues to make improvements. So the 2 we selected, the top and bottom ones there, around whole person working and the one around service user engagement. And with that in mind, we created these 2, what we've called exam questions that have guided the second year cohort's work. I'm sure they're very sick of seeing them by now. The first is about how we can more systematically make better use of the assets and experience of service users when designing services. And the second one is about how we can move towards policy and services that operate on a whole person basis. So how did the programme go about trying to answer those questions? Well, this is the path that we tried to encourage the pairs to take over the course of the year. The idea was that first we'd send them off after our first cohort workshop back in July and ask them to identify an instance of one of those disconnects that they experienced in their own practice. Often the different cohort members from around the country, and so Whitehall civil servants would go out with them, identify these issues on the ground, and then they'd really look into them, understanding kind of why are these problems happening, who is involved in making them happen, and they'd come back to our second workshop with a small case study about that disconnect. The next thing we asked them to do was to think about how that disconnect in an ideal world could be resolved, who needed to act to make things better, and what would they need to do differently to what they were currently doing. And then finally, through the last 2 workshops with the cohort members, we asked them to think about what they could do, firstly in their own jobs to make a difference, and secondly, what they could produce that they could help others to understand where they've come, what they've learned, and to help them address those disconnects in the future. So through the year, we haven't answered those 2 questions, which are very broad in their entirety, but what we have done is we've created 4 themes, or what we're calling pointers for improvement under each, which have been tested with the cohort and emerge out of the cohort's own thoughts and experiences and insights over the year, but also the input from participants in roundtables and workshops since last year. So we identified 4 pointers for improving service user involvement. At a high level, these sound fairly broad, but there's some real insight behind them, some really good case studies in the report that I'd really encourage you to read, and you will also hear from the cohort directly their stories and thoughts about these issues when you break out into those sessions in a moment. The first insight under this heading, under the service user involvement question, was about matching your engagement methods to your aims. So there are many ways of involving service users in policy and services, from large-scale consultation to behavioural insights models to full-on co-production of services locally. Policymakers who participated in the programme told us that the programme had made them realise that you can go much further than they had ever thought in involving service users in their work. And this realisation is reflective of the fact that people making policy and designing services don't always have the best overview of the range of models that exist for collecting service user insight and using it productively. Policymakers and service designers should probably understand this range a bit better, is our recommendation. But also they need to pick the model of service user engagement that meets both their policymaking aims and their methods. One great example of this is the case study in the report of Helen and Larry, who are cohort members who are here and have a stall next door, who compared the method of understanding user needs used by the digital inclusion team, Larry's team within GDS, to the method of understanding user needs used by the Birmingham Changing Futures project, which uses a panel of experts by experience, a method that's used by a lot of the different big lottery investments. So do go and talk to them. They've got some fantastic leaflets, reports about what they've found and how that model could be translated into government, more widely into government working. I would really recommend you talk to them. The second theme that we uncovered under this question was about knowing how to find your service users. Effective service user engagement, it sounds obvious, but obviously it requires that you reach the people who are often termed hard to reach or difficult to reach, but you have to do it in a suitable way. And policymakers in Whitehall can often feel removed from their service users on the ground, and there aren't always clear incentives for those service users when they are approached by Whitehall policymakers to get involved with policymaking. One idea that was discussed in one of our round tables on this issue was the idea of creating more formal brokering services, probably a role for VCS organisations that could bridge the gap between service users and policymakers. The third pointer for improvement is about ensuring adequate resources and capability when doing service user involvement. So it's not always easy to engage service users in policymaking, but equally it doesn't have to take as much time and money as people often think. There is ongoing effort needed to ensure that service user voices are genuinely making a difference, and different models of service user engagement, going back to our first point, take different skills, whether it's about the empathy and independence that comes with using people as your kind of voices for programs to talk to other service users who have lived experience themselves, or the data skills that are involved in much larger scale customer insights models. Finally, we thought that actually one of the tips we have is thinking very carefully about the language that you're using when you're engaging with service users. One of our cohort pairs, Jenny and Steph, again, have a wonderful stall outside with some top tips for policymakers and practitioners about how to use language. But there is a common theme that participants identified over the year about jargon, negative phrasing, labelling, being alienating to service users, and how, actually more interestingly to me at least, how service labels like housing and welfare and mental health can be an excuse to create artificial divides between services that don't necessarily make sense to service users themselves. However, on the other side of that, using language in a positive, inspiring way. We heard plenty of stories about how that really helped service users to come on board with services, to seek help, and then respond well to those services. So I think across all levels of the service delivery chain, professionals should be aware of the effects of their language and work with service users themselves to get it right. So those are the four under the service user involvement, the 4 pointers under the service user involvement question. Under the whole person working question, we also have 4. The first is around collaboration. Now, most of the big lottery fund investments work in local partnerships led by a VCS organisation, but which bring together local government, health, and different voluntary organisations. And one of the common themes here is around bringing together services in order to create a seamless offer to service users themselves. Now, it's not necessarily easy to create these local partnerships. Our colleagues at the Big Lottery Fund tell us that some of them had more struggles than others, but participants working on these programs emphasized to us that establishing and maintaining the effective collaboration takes a lot of time and skill that actually often isn't reflected or accounted for in their other commissioning and funding processes that they have to go through. The second pointer is about getting the central local division of labour right. There's a very common theme in our discussions this year about what the appropriate roles are for central government, local voluntary services, and what kind of services each of those should be delivering. We think that here at the Institute that it's an essential part of the modern policymaker's role to understand what happens when their policy hits the ground. And as central policymaking becomes a bit more about stewarding systems rather than Whitehall-led top-down delivery chains, policymakers need to become a bit better at recognising the effects of their policy on the ground and the benefits of working at different levels in the system. That might sound a bit high level, but one good example of what that means is one of our pairs in the second cohort who looked at how young people taking up work experience placements organised by Talent Match, the big lottery's investment into young people who are far from the labour market. They were finding that when Talent Match were offering young people work experience placements, some of them were finding that their benefit entitlement was being affected. And our pair talking to DWP couldn't really understand why, because policy seemed to be flexible enough to allow those young people to take up those work experience placements. But based on the experience of the young people themselves, it seemed that the different JCP advisors in different branches were interpreting policy slightly differently. So I think that's just one indication of how policymakers could understand some of the effects about what they're doing at the centre and how that translates down to the local role and what the kind of flexibilities are there, and think a bit more strategically about which levels it's most effective to operate services at. The third one on this, these four, is about being sensitive to problems around transition and continuity of services. Lots of our VCS participants told us about how new national programs coming in disrupt existing good practice and partnership on the ground, especially when they're not coordinated well with existing local services or don't build in transition periods. So participants thought it was really important for policymakers and commissioners to be really sensitive to existing arrangements, to existing partnerships at a local level when recommissioning and replacing services. And the final point seems, again, like a fairly obvious one, which is about the use of commissioning. There was barely a discussion this year in which commissioning in some form didn't come up. But our recommendation here is more about building the desire for whole person services intentionally into the aims and processes of commissioning. And more specifically, treating commissioning as a tool with which to encourage more joined up working. And there are, as our work has shown, really creative and different models like social impact bonds, like pooled budgeting, that remain underused. But there are barriers there around commissioners' skills and understanding about these models, which aren't always present at the moment. One really good pair to go and talk to about that if you're interested about that, Alex and Andy, who are somewhere in the audience and also have a stall out there, who focused this year on what they could learn from an effective local example of a technique called competitive dialogue. And they have a number of lessons and are in the process, I think, of producing a how-to guide for other commissioners. Finally, I think to move away from the content of what we've learned this year, the report that we've launched today and that you should have a copy of is divided into two sections. And the first is about the learning and insight from the second year, which I've just run through. And the second reflects back on our experience of having 2 years of running the programme, discussing the merits of connecting policymakers with practitioners and being quite open about some of the lessons we've learned in doing so. I won't go through all those lessons now, and you're about to hear from two cohort members who will tell you a bit more and with a much more authentic voice than mine about what they've learned working together. But we do have some general lessons that we think we've learned, which I will run through very quickly. The first is that sharing experience is a really valuable way to learn. Where the pairs worked out, and the majority did, both sides clearly gained a lot of insight from seeing the world from the other person's perspective, whether going into Whitehall to see how departments work or going to the front line to see how those services operate on the ground. Most participants who talked to us since, and the evaluation of our first year showed that participants find this really valuable, in some cases really eye-opening, and much more a kind of richer experience than a more conventional one-off visit. The second point, hopefully fairly obvious from the way I introduced this with the 5 disconnects, but there are real disconnects between policy and practice. We've learned that there is still a big gap, but that by working together, representatives of both sides of the fence were able to learn, reach consensus, and begin generating solutions to get around those disconnects. The third one is around shared problem solving. So the way that the program was built is around giving cohort pairs a shared problem to go away, look at together, work out how they're looking at it differently, and then try and resolve it. The aim was never to generate silver bullets for these huge social policy questions, but to identify small practical bits of advice or tools that will help narrow the policy and practice gap in the future. As you've heard, a number of those have come through, and we look forward to hearing more from the cohort members as they complete their work, and most of that will be published on our blog, which there should have been a link to here, but you can find on our website in the near future. To quickly run through the last few, there is value in exposing Whitehall to service users. That should have been obvious from the big section that I devoted to how we do this better, but actually it's reflected in the way in which the cohort themselves have worked. Lots and lots of cohort members have really loved the fact that this has been an opportunity to step away from their desks and get down and meet service users with whom they often, well, some of them engage very often, others not so much. But this program has shown that that's a real bonus for policymakers. The final 2 points are a bit more about our program itself. One is that scale will remain a real issue. There will always need to be some intermediaries between high-level policy concepts, but also people working in policy and what happens on the ground. This program can't be aggregated up hugely. It takes a lot of time and resources, and there remains a big challenge for Whitehall in thinking through how much it needs to do in order to make those connections a bit more common. And the final one is about more interchange could help, but could be difficult to get off the ground. This has been a year-long program, which requires a commitment of 5 days from each of the cohort members, which is quite a big commitment. But even so, it can still only scratch the surface of bridging some of the understanding gaps between the sectors. And ideally, there would be more opportunities for proper interchange between those in central departments and the VCS. And both sides could consider in more depth what they could do to build on the links they've developed already.
Great, thank you very much, Joe. So next we want you to hear from two of the people who took part in the programme. So Matthew Nicholas, who works at the Ministry of Justice, and Dominic Ruffy, who works at the Amy Winehouse Foundation. And they're going to talk through their experience of actually doing this programme and what difference it's made to them as professionals. So, yes. And they couldn't fit on the stage, by the way, which is why we relegated them.
Okay, so hi, I'm Dominic from the Amy Winehouse Foundation. And for the foundation, my role is to manage the Big Lottery funded resilience programme, which is our prevention and early intervention programme for secondary schools. I've also worked and continue to work with the Big Lottery on the multiple complex needs programme as a citizen with lived experience of multiple and complex needs. So I sit on the external reference committee for that programme and look at things on a kind of national level from a service user engagement perspective. Matt and I were paired together on the programme, so we spent the first day enlightening each other about our respective backgrounds and day jobs. During that process, we found out we went to sister schools. I got expelled, Matt didn't. Complex, complex needs, no complex needs. Yeah, and we began the process of identifying a disconnect that we could work on. With AWF, the foundation being focused on disadvantaged young people as part of our kind of external grant-making process. And with Matt's role in the Youth Justice Policy team at MOJ, we thought we'd look at the issue of homelessness in the high-risk young offender population. An area of government policy and indeed law that dictates that young offenders should be housed upon exiting prison, but that sadly in practice it's simply not the reality in many of the boroughs across London and indeed broader counties across England. So that's what we chose to look at. I'm going to hand you over to Matt to talk a little bit about himself and what he's gained out of the programme, and then I'll come back to me and do a bit more myself. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, as I said, I'm Matthew Nicholas. I'm a policy official from the Ministry of Justice, responsible for advising ministers on the rehabilitation of young offenders. I mean, my interest in getting involved in the programme stemmed really from a really strong desire to get a better insight into the work of VCSE and local authority colleagues who work day in, day out to translate our policy initiatives in Whitehall into something really tangible, meaningful and effective on the ground. I've got an absolutely enormous amount out of the programme and working with Dominic, but what I want to reflect on briefly here with you now is just how much I got out of the opportunity to visit a whole range of frontline services and spending time with the practitioners responsible for delivering them. Of course, going to see different parts of the front line is something that all policymakers do, and if they don't, really should do, try and fit in as much as possible. However, all too often, the realities of our day jobs tends to mean that we don't get out and about as much as we would like to or really should. However, participation in this programme has given me a great opportunity and impetus to get out away from my desk and get out and visit a whole range of different services not directly related to my day job. This included a really eye-opening and thought-provoking trip to a youth centre for homeless young people in North London. As Dominic said, as part of our project, we've been working really hard to try and understand the challenges facing securing housing for vulnerable young people. I did my best to get my head around the subject in the usual way, so reading round, talking to other civil servants. However, it was only after actually getting out there and witnessing these challenges being faced by practitioners, being faced by service users firsthand, meeting them, hearing about the challenges of legal duties not being adhered to, of agencies failing to work together, all of which we can talk to you about in more detail later on if you want to come visit our stand. But let's give ourselves a bit of a plug. But it was actually hearing from the horse's mouth, so to speak, about these challenges that really brought it home, and only then did I really feel I could have any reasonable claim to understanding these issues. This experience was incredibly valuable to me, for all the reasons I've set out, and to really also see the extent to which policy devised with the best intentions can end up landing those charged with delivery with a lot of very difficult unintended obstacles. Aside from helping us a lot with our project, this really got me thinking a lot about just how important it is for policymakers to make a real effort to maintain a comprehensive, fresh understanding of delivery on the front line. As I alluded to earlier, so often the pressures of our day job, the daily grind of routine submissions, correspondence, parliamentary questions, can make us feel like we don't have the time to unshackle ourselves from our desks and get down to a job centre plus, a prison or a hospital to see what's going on. However, the visits I was able to undertake with Dominic, with his help, putting me in touch with his contacts, in a variety of areas, have really hammered home just how important it is for policymakers to do this and how it should form an absolutely core and central part of our day jobs in a way that I don't think it always does. It's made me really realise how important it is for us to get out there and ensure that we have a real understanding of how policy works on the high street rather than in Whitehall, to ensure that we can get that live, in-person understanding of the complexities of service provision on the ground and the challenges that these can present, to understand the needs of service users properly, in depth and from them rather than second-hand, and to understand the innovative approaches being developed and deployed by practitioners on a daily basis, sometimes the workarounds, fantastic workarounds they have to develop to make our policies actually work in practice. Because without this, there's a real and genuine risk that policy development by those undertaking it can drift into the realms of academic, esoteric exercise and not be seen as what it is, which is an integral part of a wider process which stretches well beyond the confines of our desk and departmental HQs and the Minister's office. With this in mind, and just to sum up, this experience has given me a chance to really think about how best I can get out and really build my understanding of what's happening in my policy area and in the public sector more widely. I've resolved personally to try and get out of the office at least one day a month to visit either a youth justice service or a completely different part of the delivery landscape to kind of understand the challenges and the opportunities that are there. And I'm not entirely grateful for this, but I've instituted a rolling programme for my team, making sure that they do the same thing. And again, take a day out from the day job at least once a month and get out and go and see something new. And I'm exploring opportunities back in the department to see if we can establish a slightly more formal programme that allows my colleagues and I to get out for more than a day a month for a slightly longer period and to really find opportunities to put ourselves into the shoes of those public, private and BCSE sectors colleagues who are actually making our policies a reality. Anyway, that's my brief reflections, and I'll hand you over to Dominic to share some of his.
Okay, thanks, Matt. You can tell he writes speeches for ministers. I don't. So, yeah, on a serious note, both as a citizen being out there getting expert experience with treatment services, and then latterly, no longer being in treatment services, but being on the ground delivering services both at the foundation and experiencing some of the complex needs work that's been going on. The kind of blame culture of pointing the finger at policy and policymakers is just kind of given. When I was out there doing what I was doing, I certainly blame policy for all that. And, you know, delivering services today, it's very easy to say, you know what, it's their fault. If policy was better, this wouldn't be happening. So to be invited onto this programme to understand what really goes on in Whitehall has been invaluable to me personally and to my organisation, and then likewise to the people that we tend to sit around tables with in our day job, because we're able to pass some of that experience on and stand up a little bit more for policymakers generally. Matt arranged a number of meetings for us with a variety of teams, so the Troubled Families team, the Social Investment team at the Cabinet Office, the Youth Justice Policy team, which is Matt's team, and the Transforming Rehabilitation team. And first off, without blowing smoke up anybody's backside, I will say that I was massively impressed by the passion and desire of these individuals to make a difference, and how wholeheartedly they believe that the policy that they are creating is going to change things on the ground, and that they really want it to. You know, it's very easy to kind of sit back thinking these people don't care, but that's not the reality I saw when meeting all these people at Whitehall, which changes my perspective of how I go about doing my day job, which is a valuable thing to me. I spent a day shadowing Matt at the Ministry of Justice. I got to understand what the Minister's responsibilities are, how Matt and his team support that, what that entails. I learned more about justice policy per se. I learned how the various government departments do and don't work together, all of which was knowledge that I previously lacked, in honesty, although I was willing to pass comment on when they were asked. And I feel it's vital for me to understand this stuff if I'm going to learn, and as organisations we're going to learn how we can actually affect government policy more constructively moving forward. I found our visits to the services extremely rewarding. It was great being there with Matt, seeing Matt interact with the people that are actually trying to change their lives by working within the structures that policy is hoping will help them rebuild and change their lives. And you were very well received as well. It was nice. There was some really good interaction. Do you know what I mean? A very, very, very rewarding experience. I feel the programme has opened up a network of policy professionals which I would not have had access to previously. I wouldn't have known how to get access to them previously. And it means that moving forward, any work that we see that's going on, whether it be our own or other organisations, I feel we can now more effectively communicate to central government with the hope that it will influence policy moving forward, which is a brilliant thing. And I feel the programme has offered an excellent opportunity to demonstrate the value of service user engagement to policymakers. We've held roundtables here where we have presentations from a variety of service user organisations and individuals which went down extremely well, with some evidence of some remarkable outcomes of what happens on the ground when you actually engage with service users. And I know that's something that Matt's taken away from the programme, and ultimately one hopes will lead to policymakers finding a means by which they can not just engage with service users, but find a way to actually enable service users to become decision makers within that process themselves. So yeah, to conclude, it's been a fantastic time. My commitment is I will now desist from deriding government policy and policymakers at every available opportunity. And I do also now kind of champion the benefits of trying to understand the complexities of the job that guys and girls like Matt and his team face on a daily basis, and sharing that kind of knowledge with colleagues across the VCS sector so they become a little bit more understanding and willing to work with policy professionals to try and affect some real change. So yeah, thank you.
Very much. So finally we're going to hear from Dawn Ostwick, who is Chief Executive of the Big Lottery Fund, for your perspective on all of this and what the Big Lottery Fund are up to.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just go over here, if I may. I'm not going to speak too long because I don't want to get between you and the more interesting stuff. Actually, it's very nice to be on such a large platform, because yesterday I launched our new strategic framework at a stakeholder breakfast, quite a small one in our office, and the platform was actually a crate. So it was about that long, and that wide. And anyone who knows me in terms of speaking knows that I move around a lot. So it was a subject of great interest for my team. In fact, I think they probably did it deliberately to see if I could actually manage to speak and stand still at the same time. I did, just about. So it's very nice to have a little bit more space today. First thing I want to say is thank you to all of you who've participated in this programme, and also to the Institute for Government for your enthusiasm, your commitment, the time you've given and the insights that you've brought to the programme. And I thought what you were saying in terms of the findings and so on were really, really fascinating, and some kind of rich material in there, so thank you. Why have we done this? Why is this a big lottery funded activity? Because, as you know, this is built on the back of the strategic funding programmes that we're currently running in England, 5 of them, which aim to each take what you could call a seriously knotty problem, and to try and shine a light on it and look at how that problem might be solved with a common set of characteristics in terms of the design, which I'll just come back to. This is an opportunity to add a little bit more, another dimension into that, to get people talking about them, learning from them, dissecting them, and hopefully taking some of that learning away and applying it into the rest of their day jobs. So these programmes that we're running, what are the characters? Why have we decided to approach them? They are knotty issues. There are some things about our funding that are peculiar to us that give us a bit of freedom and flexibility. That means that we can sit outside systems sometime and have a go at something that others might not be able to. So we wanted to take some of those really difficult issues and explore whether it was possible over a sustained period of time. So most of them are 10 years in the delivery and the development, as many of you will know. They have a very strong layer of evaluation and research built into them, so that we make sure that we capture and we learn as we go along, and that feeds back into the system. But they also recognised that actually to try and solve some of these problems, and you guys will absolutely know this better than we possibly could, and in fact it's because you told us that we're doing this in some ways, these things take time, they take a long time. And they're all actually still quite early days. So there is a lot of learning, but probably a lot of it is still to come through. So we are trying to be ambitious. Are there ways of unlocking new approaches? Are there ways of thinking differently? The design of the programmes are across a series of different locations. They're all partnerships, in the main VCSE led, but they also have a thread running through them about people. And I'm going to try not to say service user too much, because it's about people. And it's people that we're interested in. And sometimes when you look at the difficulties we have in solving these problems, one can feel a bit overwhelmed by the complexities of systems and structures, and the difficulties of changing them. And that can be a bit depressing. I'm sure you've all experienced that. I certainly experience that sometimes. We experience it in our own organisations too. But fundamentally, what gets you out of bed and what gets you over that is actually the interaction with people. It doesn't really matter whether those people are what you might call the client group, or those people are the policymakers that you were just describing, because it's the people that inspire and it's the people that make a difference. So we mustn't be too overwhelmed by the complexity of the systems and structures that we've all created, because actually, I realise this as a parent, however complicated those systems and structures are, they're nothing like as complicated as any of us. We are all much more complicated than any single system. And fundamentally, that's why actually transforming lives is often not down to systems or structures. It's actually down to a human interaction, a person and a person, maybe in a room, maybe in a park, who knows, over a sustained period of time. And it's about that relationship and the quality of that relationship. And I guess we've all got to learn how to put that at the centre and build the systems and the structures around it. And I think that's a really, really tough challenge. One of the things that I would say about our experience so far in running these programmes is it is actually quite hard. It is difficult to get it right. We will need to adjust and adapt as we go along. I thought your point about language was so apposite, actually. I've got in my briefing note, one of the challenges in designing services for people whose lives are complex. It's not about designing services for people, it's about people designing the services they need and the rest of us supporting that. And of course the language thing is, and we all fall victim to that, I do it every day. It's so easy because we've all got those patterns inbuilt in how we do things. And of course the language actually, it isn't entirely accidental because it's how we've all developed. So we have to consciously change some of that and do it differently. I noticed one of the other sort of difficulties is shared goals aren't always shared goals, and I've got a little example here which I think is really interesting. National level DWP want to help people in recovery find work and away from benefits. For local commissioners, work is a means to an end, in this case full recovery from drugs, for health and community safety goals. Well, I thought that was really interesting because neither of those starts with a person. They both start with a structure or a system. So I thought that was actually quite profound and slightly depressing, but then I thought about the people, so it was all right. I just wanted to say a little bit about that point about ownership. I visited a project in Manchester, which is part of our multiple and complex needs programme, and it's being the partnership manager shelter. It's called Inspiring Change Manchester, and they had just created a space which they were going to work from, the partnership, for the next however many years. Is there someone? Yes, there is. I knew I recognised you. I was thinking, who is that chap? Do you mind if I just say what an inspiring day I had with you guys? And the reason was because this space, which we went through the door, it was a sort of slightly underwhelming sort of entrance. Go through the door and you come into this beautiful environment. It's beautiful. There's a wooden floor, it's light, there's glass. The staff who work there are separated by glass and openness, so that there is no threshold or formal barrier or walls. The space has places for people to use the internet, it's got places for people to eat and drink, it's got comfy chairs, it's got spaces for therapy rooms. And we have we were fortunate to be able to meet some of the folk who designed this space. And of course, they were the people who were going to be using it. And the people who worked with the people who were going to be using it were also people who in a past life might have been using it. So they absolutely understood what it felt like to go into those institutional settings that they would have to confront with mainstream services, which they described as generally you have to stand in a corridor, it's pretty cold, there's never any food and drink. If you get to talk to someone, generally there's a grill between you. And they talked about the difference between the environment that they'd created and the environment that they generally experienced, and how that made them feel as human beings about themselves. And I thought that was so profound. Now this project hasn't even really started yet, but it seemed to me that that was a really inspiring way of thinking about how we do things, and I know some of others of you are absolutely in this groove too. And it seemed to me that actually we've got to think about people and not about systems and structures, and we must start with those human beings. A couple of other observations, then I'm going to stop because I know I'm going on too long. One of the real risks of this whole area is the desire to solve some of these problems, to transform lives and enable people to live fulfilled lives, sometimes is at risk of getting confused with, inevitably, and we all live in this world, the need to save money. And the problem of trying to run those two things together is when one gets in the way of the other. And I think sometimes we have to be really clear about what actually we're really trying to do, and when is something instrumental towards something else, and when is it a primary motivator, because we won't get to the good lives for people if we're always trading that with money. Now I know the real world is that you do trade with money, of course you do, but actually it's about what's the driver. given that it is hard, and you've talked a little bit about policy and practice, I think that's such an interesting question. Where does policy end and practice begin? Where are the boundaries? I do sometimes wonder whether there might perhaps be a little bit less policy and a bit more practice. That's a very heretical thing to say. But I also think it's quite interesting as where's the push and where's the pull in that dynamic. So where does the change come from? Where does the innovation come from? And how does it become change that isn't simply at the margins? Which is the real challenge for us in these funding programs, because although it's a lot of money by the standards of the VCSE, and we are a huge funder of the VCSE, it's a tiny amount of money in comparison with public funding. And therefore, it's behoven to us to think about how do we make sure that the lessons, the stories, the inspirations, the changes that we really do think and can track making a difference become known, they become disseminated, they become part of a developing practice. And I think this is a real challenge. We can do our bit by supporting programs like this. We need to really focus on our research and evaluation so that we have some data, because everybody loves data, and data, I love data actually. I think it's, you can see I'm getting excited, I'm already rubbing my hands about data. Because quite a lot of areas are a bit data free, not data for data's sake, but data's good. But it probably also requires some acts of generosity and acts of risk in order to actually make those changes. Even with the evidence, it'll be hard, it won't be straightforward. We're particularly excited and pleased about having been involved in all this and the way in which this worked, because in some ways it's helped us formulate our thinking moving forward. I said yesterday I was launching our strategic framework, and I'm just going to share two key things from that that are absolutely relevant to this and have helped us think about what we want to do as we move forward and how we act as a funder. The first is that the byline for our new strategic framework is called People in the Lead. I don't need to say much more than that because I've already gone on a fair amount about it. It's about starting from what people bring to the table, not what they don't have. That's quite a challenge for a funder, because funders are always interested in people telling them what's the worst possible thing that in your life, and we'll see if we can make it better, as opposed to tell us about what's brilliant about yourself and your community and how we can help you build on that. But it's also about recognising that actually if we help equip people with tools, with money, with advice, with confidence sometimes, which some of those things bring, perhaps with access to things that they might not otherwise have, they're by far the best place to work out how they solve their problems or how they rise to the challenges of their lives or seize the opportunities that are in front of them. The second bit is that we recognise that we're quite a peculiar entity. We're a very large funder in the voluntary and community sector. We're an NDPB, so we're a part of government. Our funding comes actually from people who buy lottery tickets, so it's not exchequer. That's quite a nice amalgam and makes us quite idiosyncratic, but it also gives us an opportunity to move across different areas. And we're really keen, and you'll see how this comes full circle to this evening, that we use that peculiar position to be a catalyst for others to achieve their dreams and their ambitions. And that's about how we can convene, how we can disseminate knowledge and learning, how we can collaborate with people, how we can share some of the amazing stories that those we fund can tell, but also how we can share some of the brilliant impact and evaluation work that they do on a project-by-project basis or on a program-by-program basis. So for us, this has been a brilliant opportunity actually to learn as we go along, to feed into our strategic framework and hopefully learn even more as we go forward. So thank you, and I'm really looking forward to going outside and learning a bit more about what you're all up to. Thank you.